So my name is Johannes Refisch. I'm the coordinator of the secretariat of the Great Apes Survival Partnership, a secretariat which is under UNEP and based here in Nairobi. And today I'm going to talk to you about the threats to primates. And this is important because if you don't understand the threats correctly, it will be very difficult to develop a proper conservation strategy. As you can see from the name, I've worked with great apes, so I will focus a lot on great apes in my talk today, but the threats great apes are facing are equally relevant for other primate taxa too. So before we go into the threats, let's first understand where we have great apes in Africa. So the widest range is with the chimpanzees, indicated in green on the map. Pretty much most of equatorial Africa. There are a few countries in West Africa. They unfortunately have lost the chimpanzees, but historically they were a chimpanzee range state. We also have gorillas split into two species, the eastern and the western gorilla. Probably most known to you, the mountain gorillas in the east and the eastern lowland gorillas. And then we have the western lowland gorilla indicated in orange on that map, and a tiny little population of cross-river gorillas between Cameroon and Nigeria. And then the area south of the Congo River in yellow, that's the home of the bonobos. Of course, we have great apes in Asia too. I'm going to speak about that later. So what is GRASP? So GRASP is a UN-led partnership, and the secretariat is provided by UNEP and UNESCO, housed here in UNEP in Nairobi. And our partners include many organizations, including the UN Convention Secretariat, the Convention on Biological Diversity, CITES, Convention on Migratory Species, the World Heritage Center, RAMSA, 23 Great Ape range state governments, over 50 NGOs, 4 private businesses, many donor governments and foundations. And we are united in our aim to conserve great apes and their habitats in Africa and Asia. And I mentioned before, CITES is one of our partners, and CITES approached us a few years ago and asked whether GRASP and the IUCN Primate Specialist Group could elaborate on a report on the status of great ape population and their habitats. And we produced that report in 2018, and it was presented to the CITES Conference of Parties. And in that report, we looked and identified threats including habitat loss, disease, poaching, illegal trade in live animals. So now you wonder about my title, why I'm not speaking about climate change in that paper. Well, a lot of the information on climate change came after we launched that report. So I'm going to talk about that as well. But important to note, only one subspecies of great apes has increased in numbers over the past 40 years, and that's the mountain gorilla. And we almost doubled the numbers in the Virunga Massif. And most people think the mountain gorilla would be the most endangered great ape. Actually, it's not the case. It's a cross-river gorilla with less than 300 individuals, and they live in that border area between Cameroon and Nigeria. And then we have in Asia, in Indonesia, the Tapanuli orangutan with less than 800 individuals. So I will talk first about habitat loss and will show different elements of what is included in habitat loss. And I think that distinction is important because we really have to understand the drivers if you want to formulate a conservation strategy. And obviously we all love great apes, so let me show also a few nice photos of great apes. Here we see the chimpanzees. And chimpanzees face many threats. This is just an example from an area outside the Tai National Park in Ivory Coast and an example of slash and burn agriculture. So this is small-scale habitat conversion, but nevertheless, it has an impact on chimpanzee habitat. Now I will show you another example, also small-scale, but a completely different driver. We see here the eastern lowland gorilla in Kahuzi-Biega National Park in eastern DR Congo. So one of the key threat factors in Kahuzi-Biega is mining. There are lots of little camps, gold mining camps, camps of miners who dig for coltan. That's the element we use in our computers and mobile phones. So obviously that has a massive impact on the habitat. You see here a little schoolboy, he should be at school, but he's in the forest because these are very poor communities. And often where Africa is rich in resources, often the conflicts follow. That's a map we produced a few years ago, and you can see the coltan and cassiterite mines in these green rectangular shape. You can see the gold mines in yellow, and not far from those areas, you see red dots, and these are areas which were in conflict. There was violent conflict, and actually not much has changed. If we would produce a map in early 2022, it wouldn't be that much different. And obviously, that has an impact on the habitat and on the gorillas. We're not the only ones who have described that problem. Many organizations wrote about the conflict in the DR Congo. This is just one example. It's a Global Witness report on the mining, peace, the explosive trade in cassiterite in Eastern DR Congo. So let's now move from, let's say, more small-scale habitat destruction and habitat conversion to more large-scale development projects. Bill Lawrence, a professor in Australia, published a paper in 2015, and he identified 22 large-scale development corridors south of the Sahara. And what is especially interesting here is that some corridors have been proposed, which will basically run through Central Africa from the north to the south and vice versa. But Central Africa has never seen such a development. So our fear is that it would come with a lot of unsustainable development. And I show you just some photos from areas which might be affected by large-scale road development. These are Western lowland gorillas in the north of the Republic of Congo. So these are very remote areas and in habitats which are relatively undisturbed. But at the same time, and in the context of a new project, we and our partners overlaid geographic layers, and basically a lot of those areas are also subject to exploratory concessions for the oil and gas industry. So it will be a major challenge in the future to reconcile development and conservation, and we have to factor this into our conservation planning, because potentially this could alter the habitat massively and could have a massive impact on great ape populations and habitats. This is just another example from the DR Congo in this case. Years ago, UNEP and the World Bank worked on a project called MapX, and that was a mapping exercise together with the government institutions to basically produce geographic layers with all the mining concessions. And then we overlaid those concessions with information on great ape habitats and populations. And it wasn't a surprise. That was a huge overlap of mining concessions and protected areas. It's also important to look where is the population pressure from the human population is coming from. When we look here, we see the range of the great apes, and at the same time, we see information on human population densities. And when you look into equatorial Africa, pretty much the areas with the lowest human population pressure or density is in the Republic of Congo, in Gabon, and parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo south of the Congo River. And when you take that area, which is in red on the map, that's actually the habitat of the bonobo. So bonobos live in a very remote landscape. And when you look at it from the plane, you see undisturbed, intact forest. And these areas are becoming very scarce on the planet. Sometimes you fly over fishing villages. That's not even villages, it's basic individual families going out fishing. So very little destruction of the forest. But yeah, also those areas are involved, or basically the oil and gas concessions overlap with those areas. So the future is uncertain. So when we talk about large-scale land conversion and habitat loss, we have to talk about Southeast Asia, and we have to talk about orangutans. So orangutans are only found in Malaysia and Indonesia, the two islands, the island of Borneo and the island of Sumatra. We have 3 subspecies in Borneo, and we have the Sumatran orangutan, and then the newly discovered Tapanuli orangutan, which is a small population on the island of Sumatra. These are photos from Sabah in Malaysia, from the lower Kinabatangan River. But the big problem in Southeast Asia is land conversion for the production of oil, palm oil. And when you fly, there's a photo from Sabah, you basically see kilometers and hundreds of kilometers of oil palm plantations. So this is really large-scale land conversion, which has massive impacts on great apes, but it also has a great impact on the climate. And as a result, a lot of great apes are found in rescue centers. So let's now talk about climate change, because obviously there's also connection. When we change our habitat, it has an impact on the microclimate. And let's stay in Asia, because we just spoke about the situation in Sumatra and in Borneo. So a few years ago, we have been working on a report, The Future of the Bornean Orangutan, Impacts of Change in Land Cover and Climate. And what we did, we actually did a simulation exercise. We looked at what is suitable habitat for orangutans currently, in 2050 and in 2080. And we used the information from the climate scenarios prepared and developed for the UN framework on climate change. And when you look, currently all in gray is suitable orangutan habitat. Obviously, a lot is more in the central areas, because those are the areas with mountains, and mountains haven't been subject to land conversion, at least not to the same extent as the lowlands and the peatlands. By 2050, we predict that that area would be much smaller. And by 2080, only a few areas would remain. Most of them are in the mountains. And we know that the conversion to palm oil plantations is a big driver. So we also wanted to know whether climate change has an impact on palm oil production. And with increasing temperatures predicted for Borneo, our models predict that the palm oil production might go uphill. And that would mean that by the year 2080, the strongholds of the orangutan, which we're seeing right now, might be affected and might be threatened, because palm oil production might be found in areas which have not been subject to land conversion yet, and which still harbor important populations of orangutans. So this was an example of pretty much indirect impact of climate change. So climate change has an impact on agricultural production, and expansion of agricultural productivity might have an impact on great ape habitat, in this case on orangutan habitat. Let's now look another example, the mountain gorillas. Yeah, most of you are from Africa, and many of you are from Uganda and Rwanda and Eastern DR Congo, from the range states. So mountain gorillas are found in the Virunga Massif, which is shared by Uganda, Rwanda, and the DR Congo. That's the green area in the lower part of the photo. There's a second mountain gorilla population in Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda, with a small tiny extension to Sarambwe Reserve in the DR Congo. When you look at a satellite photo, you see there's not much green left. So green is indicating the forested areas in that landscape. Most has been converted to agricultural land. And that's pretty much identical with the national park boundaries. And when you actually approach the area, that's a photo from southern Uganda, and you overlook the chain of Virunga volcanoes. You see there's high human population density, a lot of farms, even areas on the top of the hills are farmed. And of course, we have mountain gorillas. Here we are again in the Virungas, and we see that agricultural production is going up to the park boundary. This in Rwanda at almost 2,700 meters. There's no buffer zone. So when I started my career many years back in the 1990s, there were many foggy days during the dry season because there were still swamps. In the meantime, these swamps have been drained to increase agricultural productivity, but it has an impact on the climate. Now we don't have the foggy days anymore, and that is really a challenge for agriculture. In the dry season, people need water, and often they tended to go into the park and to fetch drinking water. Now the climate models predict that temperatures are rising. We get an increase in rainfall, but unfortunately that rainfall is not equally distributed. We are seeing more of erratic and extreme weather rainfall events. And that's the result. We see more of flooding, we see more mudslides. So just last year, a number of authors published a really interesting paper, and they looked at the impact of climate change and tried to predict the range of African great apes under global change scenarios. And they came up with a number of conclusions. They predict a massive range decline by 2050. But range gain is uncertain, as African apes will not be able to occupy these new areas immediately due to their limited dispersal capacity. Another important point for conservation: Africa's current protected area network is likely to be insufficient for preserving suitable habitats and maintaining connected ape populations. And finally, they looked into the different ape species and subspecies. Gorillas are predicted to be affected more than chimpanzees, given the more restricted behavioral flexibility of gorillas to cope with temperature variation. So looking at that paper, we decided to look a bit more closely into mountain gorillas because they have a very limited habitat, and we do know that the gorillas are quite limited in their behavior and their adaptive capacity. And we found some interesting results. We worked together with the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. And they looked into long-term research data in Bwindi Impenetrable Forest and in the Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda. And it turned out that at days with high temperatures, gorillas tend to drink water from open water sources. And that's a completely new finding. We always believed that gorillas can meet their water requirements from their diet. And it has implications. When gorillas drink more from open water sources, they're also more exposed to parasites and to human diseases. So here we also have a connection between climate change and disease. And that leads me to the last part of my presentation, disease. You all have heard about Ebola, Ebola is a deadly disease for humans, but an equally deadly disease for great apes. And we have observed mortality rates up to 95%. So there were different waves of Ebola outbreaks in Central Africa, most between 1994 and 2005. In some cases, 95% of the gorilla population was killed. And in one paper, the authors concluded it would take 126 years for that gorilla population to recover from the shock. Although we know the disease since 1976, a lot remains undiscovered. So Ebola was known to attack human population in very remote forest villages, deep in the rainforest. It was deadly, lots of fatalities, and then Ebola went and re-emerged maybe years later, a few hundred kilometers away, sometimes thousands of kilometers away. But since 2005, we have observed that Ebola occurred in areas which were not deep into the forest, either in the forest savanna mosaic, as it was the case in Guinea, in West Africa in 2014, or in eastern DR Congo. And these are areas which have been deforested. They were forested before, but now the forest has been converted, or in areas in northwestern Uganda. We know that this has happened. We have no explanation why Ebola has moved to other habitats. And it is a big threat to great apes. So now talking about the risk of disease transmission. Great apes are our closest relatives. So many of the diseases affecting us humans are also affecting great apes. And obviously, what we don't want to see is that gorillas go into banana plantations and get into close contact with the villagers. Tourism is a very important economic model. It creates income for the national park authorities. It finances national park operations, but it's also important income for communities because a certain portion of the income from tourism goes straight to communities. But there are also risks associated with gorilla tourism or great ape tourism in general. So even years ago, the IUCN Primate Specialist Group launched best practice guidelines for great ape tourism. And one of the key recommendations was that whenever we visit great apes as tourists or as researchers, we have to wear masks. At a time, that was quite revolutionary, but now with the pandemic, I think we are pretty much used to wearing masks. But that COVID crisis had a number of implications. In the early months of the crisis, we did not know how dangerous it would be for great apes. We did know that it can potentially affect great apes because a chimpanzee in Cote d'Ivoire was infected by a previous strain of SARS. And later, a zoo population in the US contracted COVID. So in the early months, the experts recommended to suspend ape tourism until we understand the situation better. But that's not easy because people depend on income from tourism. And when you look at that slide, the tourism numbers in 2020 and 2021, and that's in the left graphics, dropped dramatically, which meant there was no income. And at the same time, and that's the case of Bwindi Impenetrable National Park, illegal activities went up in June, July 2020 from a very low level the year before the pandemic. So in response, our partners, the International Gorilla Conservation Program and Conservation Through Public Health, revisited the Great Ape Tourism Guidelines and produced a policy paper on COVID-19 and African great apes, and basically produced revised guidelines for great ape tourism, and they will be presented at the Africa Parks Congress in a couple of days in Rwanda. I also want to mention another report we were involved in, and Ben Ilri produced a report on preventing the next pandemic, zoonotic diseases, and how to break the chain of transmission. So zoonotic diseases, these are diseases which humans can contract from animals. And actually 60% of all emerging infectious diseases in humans are of zoonotic origin. Viruses are the most likely type of emerging pathogens. Human-livestock interaction enhances the chances of spillover. Livestock serves as an epidemiological infection bridge between wildlife and humans. And finally, COVID-19, Ebola, bird flu, SARS are all examples of recent zoonotic diseases. So in that report, we identified 7 drivers of emergence of zoonotic diseases and potential spillover to humans. And one of those is climate change. There are others too, and I talked already about agriculture and forest conversion. So when I can summarize my, my talk, we have a number of important threats to great apes. This is small-scale habitat conversion, in this case, slash and burn agriculture. We have large-scale habitat conversion. This is conversion into palm oil plantations. Disease, sometimes in correlation with climate change. And we have another threat, that's illegal trade in body parts and live animals. That's just the bushmeat hunter in the Republic of Congo. And these are examples from great apes which have been confiscated and ended up in rescue facilities. So I'm mentioning this because we will have an exciting talk next week, which will go into the details of illegal trade in primates, and it's a joint. It will be a joint presentation by PASA and by GRASP. It will be Iris Ho from PASA kickstarting the event, and will be followed by Charlotte Daniels and Kevin Barrett from GRASP. So I want to end my presentation with this nice slide. We hope that despite all these threats, both humans and great apes have a future and we can coexist. I thank you for your attention.
For those of us who do not live close to the habitat of the greater primates, it's truly a privilege to see through your photography to get a sense of these animals and their behavior and character. And also a presentation packed with information. I would now like to open the floor for Q&A. You're all welcome to use the reaction tools at the bottom of the screen to show your, to attract our attention, or you're welcome to ask questions in the chat. Either way, we welcome your questions. There are no stupid questions. Johannes, if I may ask, the maps that you showed, a lot of them showed threats to primates that are related to economic survival, economic activities, development. At the same time, it overlaps with other natural threats. Do you find in these countries, and I guess I put you in a spot because you're sitting in the United Nations offices, but do you find that there are the political will in Africa to, in African countries to address these issues?
Oh, it's difficult to give a general response to that question. Let's start with a positive example. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, in the early 1980s, we had 250 mountain gorillas left in the Virunga Massif and maybe an equal number in Windy. And despite enormous human population pressure and a very difficult political history in all the 3 countries, they all went through a civil war, Uganda, Rwanda, and the DR Congo. We still have mountain gorillas, and we actually have twice as many as before. So that's clearly an example that 3 countries in very difficult political circumstances have shown political will and have found a business model. Because at the end, I think it's a combination. You need political will, and at the same time, you need to give people alternatives. And I'm saying that when we go across the border and we go to Cote, and there is political will, but I mean, these are very impoverished communities. It's not enough to tell them it's not good to go mining inside a national park when there are absolutely no alternative, no schools, no food. I mean, people have to survive. So we did a number of studies in Cote, and we argued the best way to basically solve the problem of illegal mines is providing alternatives. Move the mining outside the park, have something like a relatively green mine. It's never really green, I know, but at least apply standards and give people opportunities. But just saying you shouldn't do this without providing alternatives is very difficult. These are desperate people. They have no future.
Yes. And do you see a recovery of tourism at the moment after COVID?
So yeah, I explained that the parks in Uganda and Rwanda were closed for I think 4 or 4.5 months with really devastating economic impacts, and it's cynical. I mean, we close and we want to protect our great apes. But at the same time, the economic damage is so big that even communities cannot afford to pay the medical bill and the doctors. So it's a really difficult situation. So the parks reopened for local and resident tourists and with very modest visitation numbers. But now I think with the holiday season starting in Europe, we see an increase in numbers. It is a risk, we know, but I think we have to manage that situation. So many people lost their jobs. I mean, some hotels didn't survive. A lot of tourism projects didn't survive. A lot of the national parks were struggling to maintain their operations. I think the question here is how can we manage bringing in the money, allowing tourism, and minimizing the risk?
Hi, great presentation, Johannes. Thank you so much. At the start of it, you said something intriguing, and I wanted to come back to it, and that was that in order to set effective conservation policy, you really had to understand the threats in a different way. So I was hoping you could maybe tie back to that. And so you shared a lot of amazing information, really rich. Could you talk a little bit about how people might start to use this to inform policy and conservation thinking?
Yeah,
or maybe just choose one small example. I know that's a huge question.
Yeah, no, I intentionally didn't go into too much detail because I wanted to leave it for Kevin and Charlotte to talk about it next week. But a very good example is the orangutans. When you look at global numbers of apes in captivity, most is orangutans. And you might think, well, to really stop that trade, we should increase law enforcement and have more operations and sensitize communities and all this. That's important, but the main driver is habitat loss. So those orangutans lost their habitat first, in most cases, not always, but in most cases, they lost their habitat first, and then they ended up in the villages, and people were opportunistic and tried to sell them to traders. So yeah, law enforcement is important, but I think the biggest step in undermining illegal trade in Southeast Asia would be to stop habitat conversion. Yeah. Also, I mean, I've been very involved over the past 15 years in conservation action planning, and there's never a simple solution. Everything is connected, and I think we really need to understand primary drivers and secondary drivers. So what comes next? For example, when I talk about large-scale development corridors, and we actually have a dialogue with the World Bank and its private sector arms, the IFC, because we argue when you develop big development projects, and you have your social environmental assessments, and you even look into the health part of it, but usually you look into pollution. But we argue when you change a larger landscape, you bring in new people, you bring goods, but you don't monitor and how far that affects human and wildlife health. So when doing development planning, we also should look how development is affecting our natural environment, including the health perspective. So that's what I meant. We need to understand the drivers, and we need to see how they are connected.
If limited funds and time do not allow to conserve and/or rescue primate populations, how do we decide which one to prioritize? And how do we determine which groups to invest conservation resources in? Very good question. Thanks, Gina.
Excellent question. And it needs a longer response, I'm afraid. So yeah, from a process perspective, that's exactly why we do conservation action planning. We would love to save all great apes or all primates, but it's not always possible. So we have to identify priorities. And now it's becoming difficult. And a lot has changed, let's say, over the past 10, 12, 15 years. There was an approach years ago to identify thresholds, and some people argued our resources are limited. Let's define minimum viable populations, and we focus on those viable populations in our efforts. But now with new research results, especially from the genetic side, but also from behavioral sciences, indicates that we might revise that approach, because a population with a higher genetic diversity might be in a better position to respond to, let's say, a future climate or land conversion in the future. And then some of the behavioral scientists studying culture in primates argue some populations have a wider, are richer in their culture. So even if it's a small population, but they've shown behavior which might make them better adapted to a future climate. So we might also want to conserve those. And there's an active discussion on this, how to do our conservation action planning and how to take those new research findings into account. And actually, at the moment, the IUCN is working on a review paper on primate conservation action planning for the past 40 years, and what we have learned and what we might want to change in the future. So it's an ongoing process, and it's complex.
Wow. Okay, a question from Laura, and she mentions that reception is also a bit spotty. Here at the Limbe Wildlife Center, we provide alternative livelihoods by buying agricultural byproducts, such as crop leaves, from ex-hunting communities, which we feed our rescue animals as enrichment or browse. What are some other examples of alternative livelihoods? Sorry if this has been asked or answered already. My connection is very spotty in Cameroon.
Yeah, great question. And hello to Limbe. I've been there only once, but you guys are doing an amazing job. Yeah, alternative livelihoods, that depends on the local context. Obviously, for many years, tourism has been promoted, and in case of the mountain gorillas, but also in some areas, tourism has been an excellent way of generating income for park management or wildlife authorities and communities. Unfortunately, in some countries, we are over-dependent on income from tourism, and we have had a really devastating situation during the pandemic. So one of the approaches we want to test is how to find alternatives to tourism. We don't want to replace tourism, but we want to have a safety net. And there's a discussion on how to use a model called wildlife credits, so that communities would be paid performance-based, so they would be paid if connected from tourism. There have been some pilots in Namibia, but there's still a connection to tourism. There's also a pilot in Cambodia on the conservation of the giant ibis. We want to look a little bit more into the model, the economic model, and then probably test it in a great ape, in a non-great ape site.
That sounds very promising and hopefully promising, but at least very interesting. Thank you, Laura, for joining from Cameroon. That's fantastic that you came in. Johannes, you mentioned ongoing reports that are being written and recommendations, and it's an ongoing learning process. For students that are perhaps finishing their pre-grad studies and they're now looking at master's degrees and PhDs, are there particular areas where there's a need for research? And probably vast, but that you would recommend, and perhaps that where students could get involved with GRASP itself.
Wow. Well, there are obviously many research opportunities, but what I often tell students is, if you find a way to do your scientific work but embedded in a conservation project, you get your master's or you get your PhD, but you also gain experience on the ground, and you are already, hopefully, in an ideal scenario, part of a multidisciplinary conservation team. So you have also the chance to hear the social side, or to work with psychologists. I mean, we know that it's a very complex environment. So that's one recommendation. There are lots of research questions, and there are lots of research questions even with an applied angle. I mean, I can give you examples. We all talk about climate change, and we see these big models, but especially when we go back to the Albertine Rift and the mountain areas, often climate models reflect situations in mountains not very well, because we have a steep altitudinal gradient. And unfortunately, often in those countries, we have fragmented monitoring stations, but it's not continued, or the quality of the data is not what we need. So that's an area where a lot of more research is needed to fine-tune climate models and to analyze how does that affect great ape habitat and great apes directly. It's just one example. Yeah, economy. I mean, we talk about coexistence. And I think that's really important. We really want to make sure that wildlife is a viable land use option. If not, we are losing land, whether it will be used for charcoal production or converted to shamba for agricultural production. At the end, we lose our wildlife. So we need to find economic alternatives. And then your last question, yeah, how to engage with GRASP. We do offer intern opportunities, 1 to 2 a year, usually for 6 months. You need to have a little bit of experience and have done advanced a little bit on your university career, but there are opportunities. And I can say that a lot of our former interns have ended up in conservation, which makes me quite happy, because that's all what we want.
Johannes, if you look at the map of Africa, are there where primates occur, are there new opportunities that are being in terms of reserves that are being developed at the moment that are exciting and need support?
You mean where we have created new conservation areas?
Where new conservation areas are being established.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I think it's not easy in a more populated planet, on a more populated planet, to create new conservation areas because they're conflicting interests. But yes. We as GRASP, we were involved in upgrading reserve in Liberia to full national park status. It's a grebo forest, which is has become a national park, and it's a new opportunity. And we were quite proud of that, together with our partners who did most of the field work. And we also followed proper safeguards principles. I mean, that it's a big discussion in the media. You see it every day, that criticism of the conservation committees that we have created conservation areas without former proper consent by communities and proper community engagement. In that case, that was all done correctly and for the benefit of both people and wildlife. And many concepts now look into how can we ensure coexistence so that we have protected areas, but people are living there. But they do it in a way that it's not detrimental to nature. Yeah, new opportunities. We have a big project in Central Africa. We are just kickstarting it, or we had the inception workshop 3 weeks ago in the 2 Congos. It's in the Congo peatland area, the Lactil-Lactumba landscape. It's a fantastic area, highest densities in gorillas, but it's also an area which stores carbon, the equivalent of 2 years of global greenhouse gas emissions. But the interesting part is these are community conservancies. So the land belongs to the communities. So these are opportunities. And we hope that we can contribute to the coexistence and develop a sustainable development pathway.
Yeah, that's also fantastic that this is now land that belongs to communities, because the historical legacy of many game reserves in Africa is that land has been taken away from communities and used for, and it starts on the wrong foot. Now it's a new generation of reserves that start on the right foot, and that's fantastic. Another question from Gina. How important is predation on primates, mostly in DRC?
Natural predation or predation by human hunters?
Gina, would you like to clarify both?
Oh, it depends a bit. I mean, there have been quite a few publications, especially, I mean, in many areas, but the two I really remember well, from the Thai forest and chimpanzees hunting red colobus. There are similar results from Kibale. There are obviously more predators, the crown eagle and the leopard. So it depends on the landscape and the forest, in how high natural predation rates are. What we found out at Thai is quite interesting. There's natural predation, but primates have developed different strategies to avoid predation. So and some species like the red colobus, they're big in numbers to reduce the risk for the individuals. Other colobus monkeys try to associate with them, and some granians too, because they know that most often it's the red colobus being taken by the eagle or by the chimpanzee. And then there's also an olive colobus, which is very low in numbers. So they have a very cryptic behavior. They avoid predation. So now you bring the humans in, and that's interesting, because nowadays they have shotguns. So if you try to defend yourself in numbers, you are a prime target for human hunters. So it's a red colobus suffering first from human predation. And interestingly, we did population surveys. In the hunting areas, the proportion between the different species changed. So cryptic behavior won. So we had comparatively more olive colobus in a hunting area in comparison to the other species, because the others were hunted first by humans. So it's very interesting. And as always, we humans, we change everything, and that's a problem. Yeah. In evolution, it takes 10,000 of years, and we do that in a few years, and then we expect that that nature can adapt.
That's a very, very interesting observation. It takes me back to the lecture by Dr. Jenny Botting on the different approaches, even the different cultural systems within primates, and it makes you think where humans fit in. Fatsuma, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Johannes, and thank you, Kruger, for welcoming me earlier. Thank you for the presentation, Johannes. My observation and what I know is all the apes, their ranges are in the old world, where we have a lot of developments going on, and population explosion is endemic in these areas. I mean, human population explosion. And you told us the issue of the habitat loss being a major threat in addition to climate change. My concern or my question is that since even though these great apes have species-specific range requirements, has there been perhaps a required a calculation of the required area of each of those species, so that if there is a room for governments to negotiate with governments for those areas to be reserved, we will know that, okay, these places are just for these species. Of course, it will not be only great apes that will be there. There will be there will be monkeys in those areas, more especially as there is this issue of ecotourism, bringing in a lot of tourists and the revenues. In the long run, those governments may concede giving some specific areas earmarked for the needs of these great apes. That's my question. I wonder if I'm clear, Johannes.
No, I hope that I understood the question correctly. And I think there have been some processes and even some successful implementations. I mean, what you're referring to is basic key biodiversity areas. I just focused on great apes, but obviously the great apes is a flagship species. And if we conserve the habitat, it would benefit lots of other species too. But I mean, there are efforts in identifying worldwide key biodiversity areas so that governments see them as a priority to conserve. And the area I mentioned before, where we upgraded a reserve to a national park, it's actually part of a much larger landscape. It's a Tai Sapo transboundary landscape. It's a priority for the conservation of the West African chimpanzee. It's in the Conservation Action Plan. And that was one step to create stepstones so that we don't lose all the corridors and we keep a connected population. There are lots of challenges, of course. There's mining there, there's habitat conversion, there's agriculture. But I think that example shows some political will to implement and to keep those key biodiversity areas.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. I don't see any further questions in the chat at the moment, and I don't see any hands up. If we don't have any questions, we've been busy for an hour now. I'm going to thank Johannes for a fantastic presentation and ask you to please join us again next week as we continue our look at the threats, specifically looking at the illegal wildlife trade, etc., with Iris, as well as the staff from GRASP next week. Johannes, thank you very much. Thank you for everybody that attended. We really appreciate your time. We also learn from each other as we continue through this series.